The ego clash between David Gilmour and Roger Waters tore Pink Floyd apart in the most vicious leadership battle in rock history. Their decade-long war for creative control revealed shocking truths about power, genius, and the price of artistic ambition. The seeds of Pink Floyd's most destructive internal conflict were planted in 1973 during the recording sessions for The Dark Side of the Moon. What should have been a celebration of unprecedented creative success instead became the beginning of a psychological warfare that would consume two brilliant musicians and ultimately destroy one of rock's greatest partnerships. The album's massive commercial and critical success created an intoxicating sense of power that both David Gilmour and Roger Waters began to crave exclusively for themselves. Initially, the tension was subtle and carefully hidden, buried beneath the collaborative surface that had made Pink Floyd's music so compelling and universally beloved. Waters had conceived the album's complex philosophical framework, developing the intricate themes of mental illness, mortality, and human anxiety that gave The Dark Side of the Moon its emotional depth and psychological resonance. But it was Gilmour who transformed Waters' abstract intellectual concepts into the memorable melodies and sophisticated guitar arrangements that made the songs accessible to millions of listeners worldwide. The fundamental problem was that both men genuinely believed they were the primary creative force behind Pink Floyd's unprecedented success, and neither was entirely wrong in their assessment. Waters possessed the intellectual vision and conceptual genius that gave the band its distinctive artistic identity and philosophical coherence, while Gilmour had the musical instincts and technical skills that made their complex ideas emotionally resonant and commercially viable. This overlap of essential contributions created a fundamental ambiguity about creative ownership that would prove increasingly toxic as their egos expanded with continued success. The first public sign of serious conflict emerged during the Wish You Were Here sessions in 1975, when tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface finally began to boil over. Waters had developed an intensely personal concept album about absence, alienation, and the music industry's corrupting influence on artistic integrity and creative authenticity. He viewed the project as his most important artistic statement about the psychological cost of fame and the compromises that commercial success demanded from serious artists. However, Gilmour saw opportunities to expand the musical arrangements and add guitar elements that would enhance the emotional impact of Waters' lyrics and make the songs more accessible to audiences. What followed was a series of heated studio confrontations that revealed the fundamental difference in their creative philosophies and working methods. Waters approached music as intellectual architecture, constructing elaborate conceptual frameworks that required precise execution to maintain their artistic integrity and philosophical coherence. He became increasingly frustrated and defensive when Gilmour suggested modifications that seemed to prioritize emotional impact over conceptual purity. Waters interpreted these suggestions as direct attacks on his artistic vision, rather than collaborative improvements designed to enhance the overall musical experience. From his perspective, Gilmour was undermining the intellectual rigor that made Pink Floyd's music meaningful and distinctive. Gilmour, meanwhile, approached music as emotional communication, focusing on how songs would affect listeners rather than how they served abstract philosophical concepts. He became equally frustrated with Waters' rigid adherence to predetermined structures that sometimes sacrificed musical effectiveness for intellectual consistency. From Gilmour's perspective, Waters was becoming so obsessed with conceptual control that he was losing sight of music's primary purpose, connecting with audiences on a visceral, emotional level. The tension escalated dramatically during the Animals recording sessions in 1976, when Waters' need for creative control became increasingly authoritarian and uncompromising. Waters had conceived the album as a sophisticated political allegory based on George Orwell's Animal Farm, using different animals to represent various social classes in contemporary British society. The concept was intellectually sophisticated and socially relevant, but it also gave Waters unprecedented justification for controlling every aspect of the album's creative direction. For the first time in Pink Floyd's collaborative history, Waters began making unilateral decisions about musical arrangements, song structures, and even the other members' individual contributions to the recording process. He would arrive at the studio with detailed written instructions about how each musician should perform their parts, leaving little room for the spontaneous collaboration that had previously defined Pink Floyd's creative process and made their music so distinctive. This authoritarian approach represented a fundamental shift from collaborative partnership to creative dictatorship, transforming the recording studio from a space of mutual exploration into a battlefield for artistic control. Gilmour's response was initially diplomatic, but gradually became more confrontational as he realized that Waters was systematically eliminating his input from the creative process. He began arriving at recording sessions with his own musical ideas and pre-planned arrangements, essentially forcing Waters to choose between accepting collaborative input or engaging in direct creative conflict. These parallel creative efforts created an atmosphere of competition rather than collaboration, with both men working to assert their individual vision for Pink Floyd's musical direction and artistic future. The psychological warfare intensified dramatically during the production of The Wall in 1979, when Waters' need for complete creative control reached new levels of authoritarianism. Waters had conceived the album as an autobiographical exploration of isolation, trauma, and the psychological barriers people construct to protect themselves from emotional pain and social contact. The concept was deeply personal and artistically ambitious, but Waters' approach to its execution was more controlling than anything he had attempted previously. He demanded complete creative authority over every aspect of the project, arguing that its intensely personal nature required his exclusive leadership and artistic vision. Gilmour found himself reduced to the humiliating role of a highly paid session musician on what was supposed to be a collaborative Pink Floyd album. Waters made unilateral decisions about arrangements, instrumentation, and even Gilmour's guitar parts without consultation or discussion. The collaborative spirit that had made Pink Floyd's earlier albums so compelling and emotionally resonant was systematically eliminated in favor of Waters' singular artistic vision and personal creative agenda. The conflict reached an explosive breaking point during the recording of Comfortably Numb, which would become one of Pink Floyd's most beloved and commercially successful songs. Waters had written the lyrics and conceived the song's basic structure as part of The Wall's overarching narrative framework about psychological isolation and emotional numbness. However, Gilmour contributed the soaring guitar arrangements and melodic elements that made the song emotionally transcendent and commercially viable. The question of creative ownership became a microcosm of their larger struggle for artistic control and recognition. Waters argued passionately that his conceptual framework and lyrical content made him the song's primary author and creative architect, while Gilmour contended that his musical contributions were equally essential to its emotional impact and commercial appeal. Both men were correct from their respective perspectives, but their inability to acknowledge each other's contributions revealed how completely their egos had consumed their capacity for collaborative creativity. The dispute over Comfortably Numb became a powerful symbol of their irreconcilable differences about creative leadership and artistic ownership. Waters viewed Gilmour's contributions as technical execution of his artistic vision, while Gilmour saw Waters' concepts as raw intellectual material that required musical interpretation to become meaningful art. Neither man could accept a subordinate role in the creative process, and neither was willing to share credit for Pink Floyd's continued success. The psychological toll of this constant creative warfare began affecting both musicians' personal lives and mental health in increasingly serious ways. Waters became increasingly paranoid about protecting his creative authority, interpreting any suggestion or modification as a direct threat to his artistic integrity and personal identity as Pink Floyd's visionary leader. He developed elaborate theories about how the music industry and even his own bandmates were conspiring to diminish his contributions to Pink Floyd's success and steal credit for his creative innovations. Waters began documenting every creative interaction in the studio, creating detailed records of who contributed what ideas to which songs. He seemed convinced that without this documentation, history would unfairly credit others for his artistic achievements. This obsessive behavior created an atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance that made genuine creative collaboration virtually impossible. Gilmour, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn and resentful about his systematically reduced role in the band's creative direction and artistic decision-making. He began questioning whether his continued participation in Pink Floyd was worth the psychological cost of constant conflict with Waters and the professional humiliation of being treated as a subordinate in a band he had helped create. The musical collaboration that had once been a source of joy and creative fulfillment had become a source of chronic stress and artistic frustration. The situation deteriorated further during the disastrous recording sessions for The Final Cut in 1983, when Waters' need for control reached levels that were both psychologically disturbing and professionally destructive. Waters had conceived the album as a sequel to The Wall, exploring themes of war, politics, and personal loss through the lens of his father's death during World War II. The subject matter was intensely personal and emotionally charged, and Waters used this emotional weight to justify even more authoritarian control over every aspect of the creative process. By this point in their relationship, Waters was essentially treating Pink Floyd as his expensive backing band, rather than as collaborative creative partners with equal rights to artistic input. He made all creative decisions unilaterally, dismissed input from other members as irrelevant or incompetent, and even went so far as to exclude Rick Wright from the recording process entirely. Gilmour found himself in the humiliating position of being told exactly how to play his own guitar parts by someone who wasn't even a guitarist. The final confrontation between these two musical titans came when Waters announced his intention to take complete and permanent control of Pink Floyd's future direction, including all touring, recording, and business decisions. He had apparently convinced himself that his conceptual contributions to the band's success gave him the unquestioned right to make unilateral decisions about Pink Floyd's artistic and commercial future. This declaration of total authority represented the complete abandonment of any pretense of collaborative leadership or shared creative responsibility. Gilmour's response was swift, decisive, and legally sophisticated. He refused to accept Waters' self-proclaimed authority and began exploring comprehensive legal options for continuing Pink Floyd without him. The battle that followed was not just about creative control, but about the fundamental nature of artistic collaboration and the ownership of collective achievements that had taken decades to build. The legal proceedings that ensued revealed shocking details about the psychological dynamics that had systematically destroyed their partnership. Court documents included detailed transcripts of studio conversations that showed the extent to which personal animosity had completely replaced creative collaboration. Both men had meticulously documented instances of the other's allegedly unreasonable behavior, creating a comprehensive record of how success and unchecked ego had poisoned their relationship. The most damaging revelations concerned their mutual attempts to undermine each other's contributions to Pink Floyd's legacy and historical significance. Waters had apparently been telling record executives and music journalists that Gilmour was merely a talented guitarist who completely lacked the intellectual capacity for conceptual leadership. Meanwhile, Gilmour had been arguing that Waters' recent work demonstrated the severe limitations of his approach when working without collaborative input from musically gifted partners. The resolution of their extensive legal battle was less important than what it revealed about the devastating price of unchecked artistic ambition and ego inflation. Both men had achieved extraordinary success as collaborative partners, creating music that influenced millions of listeners and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. However, their egos had grown to the point where they could no longer tolerate sharing credit for their achievements or acknowledge their mutual dependence. The very success that should have validated their partnership and encouraged continued collaboration instead became the source of its complete destruction. Each man wanted exclusive credit for Pink Floyd's achievements, and neither could accept that their greatest work had required both of their contributions, working in dynamic tension with each other. The aftermath of their conflict provided a fascinating natural experiment in the value of collaborative versus individual genius in creative endeavors. Waters pursued his solo career with complete creative control, producing work that was intellectually sophisticated and conceptually ambitious, but commercially limited and emotionally less resonant. Gilmour continued Pink Floyd with the remaining members, creating music that was emotionally compelling and commercially successful, but perhaps less conceptually ambitious than Waters' solo work. The comparison between their post-breakup careers strongly suggested that their greatest achievements had indeed required both of their contributions working together. Waters' intellectual concepts needed Gilmour's musical interpretation and emotional instincts, while Gilmour's musical gifts benefited enormously from Waters' conceptual frameworks and philosophical depth. Their inability to acknowledge this mutual dependence had cost them both the opportunity to continue creating transcendent art together. The music industry watched their conflict with a mixture of fascination and horror, recognizing it as a definitive cautionary tale about the inherent dangers of unchecked success in creative partnerships. Record executives began paying much closer attention to the complex psychological dynamics within their most successful acts, implementing new comprehensive strategies for managing artistic egos and preventing similar destructive conflicts from erupting within their most valuable creative properties. Entertainment lawyers began incorporating specific clauses into recording contracts that addressed decision-making processes and creative authority, drawing directly from the legal precedents established during the Pink Floyd dispute. Management companies started offering psychological counseling services to their most successful clients, recognizing that creative genius combined with commercial success could create toxic psychological conditions that destroyed both artistic output and personal relationships. The psychological analysis of their conflict became a subject of academic study in business schools and psychology programs around the world. Researchers identified specific patterns in how success affects creative personalities, documenting the ways that recognition and wealth can systematically corrupt collaborative relationships. The Gilmour-Waters case became a standard example of how ego inflation can transform productive creative tension into destructive personal warfare. Music journalists and critics began developing more sophisticated frameworks for analyzing the dynamics within successful bands, looking for early warning signs of the kind of psychological deterioration that had destroyed Pink Floyd's original lineup. They started paying attention to subtle changes in band members' public statements, shifts in songwriting credits, and alterations in recording processes that might indicate growing internal tensions. The conflict also influenced how younger musicians approached the formation of creative partnerships, with many artists explicitly discussing power-sharing arrangements and decision-making processes before achieving significant success. Music educators began incorporating lessons about ego management and collaborative leadership into their curricula, using the Pink Floyd case as a primary example of how not to manage creative relationships. The therapeutic community began studying the psychological profiles of high-achieving artists, developing new understanding about the relationship between creative genius and personality disorders. The Gilmour-Waters conflict provided valuable case study material for understanding how narcissistic tendencies could be amplified by success and recognition, leading to the systematic destruction of the very relationships that had enabled that success in the first place. Psychological researchers identified specific stages in the deterioration of creative partnerships under success pressure. The initial stage typically involves subtle competition for creative credit, followed by increasingly rigid positions about artistic vision. The middle stage features open conflict over decision-making authority and creative control, while the final stage involves complete breakdown of communication and legal warfare over artistic ownership. Business consultants started offering specialized services to creative industries, helping artistic partnerships develop comprehensive structures and processes that could survive success without being destroyed by it. The Pink Floyd case became a foundational example of why creative partnerships needed active management and psychological support to remain functional as they achieved higher levels of recognition and financial reward. Contemporary music psychologists now use the Gilmour-Waters dynamic as a comprehensive template for understanding how complementary creative personalities can become incompatible under extreme pressure. Their case demonstrates that the same fundamental differences that initially make partnerships highly productive can become sources of irreconcilable conflict when filtered through ego inflation and unprecedented commercial success. The story also influenced comprehensive academic research into the complex psychology of collaborative creativity in high-pressure environments. Major universities began extensively studying how teams of highly talented individuals could maintain productive working relationships despite intense individual ego needs and recognition desires throughout their careers. The Pink Floyd case provided crucial empirical data about the specific psychological triggers that systematically transform productive collaborative relationships into destructive competitive conflicts that destroy both personal and professional bonds. The story of David Gilmour and Roger Waters' ego clash serves as a definitive cautionary tale about the psychological dangers of artistic success and the inherent fragility of creative partnerships under the extreme pressure of public recognition and commercial achievement. Their conflict demonstrated with devastating clarity how creative partnerships can be systematically destroyed by the very achievements they produce together, and how success can transform collaborative allies into bitter enemies competing for exclusive credit and recognition. The lesson is not that genuine collaboration is impossible among strong creative personalities with distinct artistic visions, but rather that it requires constant vigilance against the ego inflation that success inevitably causes in even the most grounded individuals. Creative partnerships must be actively protected from the corrosive effects of recognition, wealth, and critical acclaim through conscious effort and often professional intervention. Without this protection, even the strongest artistic bonds can be dissolved by unchecked ambition and wounded pride. Their decade-long war also revealed crucial truths about the nature of effective creative leadership in artistic collaborations between equally talented individuals. Neither completely authoritarian control nor entirely passive collaboration was sufficient for producing great art consistently over extended periods. The magic of Pink Floyd's early albums had come from the productive dynamic tension between different creative approaches and complementary personalities, not from the dominance of any single vision or leadership style. When that productive creative tension transformed from generative to destructive, the music suffered dramatically, along with the personal relationships that had sustained it. The psychological wounds from their conflict never fully healed, serving as a permanent reminder of how quickly and completely creative partnerships can transform into personal warfare and mutual destruction when ego overwhelms collaborative spirit. Their story continues to influence how contemporary musicians approach collaboration. at how the modern music industry manages creative relationships between strong personalities with competing visions. Record labels now invest significantly in relationship management and conflict resolution for their most valuable artistic partnerships. Recognizing that the financial and cultural costs of creative breakdowns can be devastating. The price Gilmour and Waters paid for their unchecked artistic ambitions was enormous. The loss of one of rock's most successful and influential partnerships, the permanent end of their personal friendship, and the devastating knowledge that they had deliberately destroyed something culturally irreplaceable in pursuit of individual recognition and artistic control. Their legacy serves as both inspiration and warning for future generations of creative collaborators. Modern conflict resolution specialists now study the Gilmour-Waters breakdown as a classic example of how communication deterioration systematically accelerates partnership destruction. Their case illustrates how creative differences, when combined with ego inflation and commercial pressure, can create toxic communication patterns that make resolution increasingly impossible as positions become more entrenched and personal attacks replace constructive dialogue about artistic vision and creative direction. If this incredible story of creative genius, ego warfare, and the destruction of legendary partnerships inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone interested in the psychology behind music's greatest collaborations and conflicts. Have you ever seen talent and ego destroy a successful partnership? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more fascinating stories about the hidden dynamics that shape artistic history.